In this segment, we're going to take a close look at the causes and consequences of the great stock market crash of 1929. The United States had emerged from World War I as a global power, not just militarily, but also economically. The stock market boomed, and optimism of the 1920s was generated with investments made with borrowed money. When those businesses failed and stocks lost their value, prices fell, production slowed, banks collapsed, and unemployment became widespread. As we analyze the specific causes of the stock market crash, we note that during the 1920s, businesses were booming, but investments were being made with borrowed money. And so we had what we consider over-speculation. That is to say, people were gambling with money that they were borrowing. There was an excessive expansion of credit, both individually by individuals who were borrowing money, but also by banks and by businesses. As businesses failed, bankruptcies occurred. And when bankruptcies occurred, that is to say businesses went out of business, employees lost their jobs, which led to even harsher economic situations. Bank deposits that had been invested in the market were now gone. And as banks lost their money, they were forced to close when the stock market collapsed. The big crash came in October of 1929, and America was never going to be the same again. This is the moment, this is the spark that most historians look to as marking the beginning of the Great Depression. Though the economy was slowing ahead of time, before this, we could sort of see it coming. This was the harsh reality and marking the beginning of the Great Depression. The consequences? Well, as clients panicked and attempted to withdraw their money from the banks, there was unfortunately no money to give them. When banks had to close up because they didn't have any money to give to these clients who were trying to withdraw their money, the banks closed, along with all of the investments, the deposits made by everybody else. Another panic was going across the stock market. People panicked and tried to sell their stock to get whatever value they could. With the laws of supply and demand, the supply of stocks went way up. The demand was way down. Stock value plummeted, which further compounded the problem. There were no new investments in the banks, as people had lost their money and they grew to not trust the banks. Banks did not see new investments, and therefore, without the money to loan out and then recollect, banks also were going out of business. Banks collapsed, fortunes were lost. The stock market collapse will provide that spark, the kick to send the nation into the Great Depression. In this segment, we're going to take a look at some of the significant hardships that were brought on by the Great Depression. What were the causes of the Great Depression? We've already discussed the stock market crash as being one of the sparks to really set it off. But it was this over-speculation on the stocks, using borrowed money that could not be repaid. That's when the stock market crashed in 1929, and stock prices collapsed. This is also called buying stocks on margin, or using a minimal down payment to borrow money. The whole system seemed to topple like an upside-down pyramid. There was also the Federal Reserve's failure to prevent widespread collapse of the nation's banking system in the late 1920s and early 1930s. This led to a severe contraction of the nation's money supply that was in circulation. Without policies put in place, the Federal Reserve could not spring into action and save the banks that were now doomed. High protective tariffs produced retaliation tariffs in other countries. As the United States refused to buy foreign goods, they in turn refused to buy our goods. While we felt initially this would protect American business, the reality of all this was that it hurt American business as we lost overseas markets due to our tariffs. The Tariff Act of 1930, that was initially proposed and designed to protect American business, did the most harm. This was popularly called the Hawley-Smoot Act, or the Hawley-Smoot Tariff, which ended up hurting America far more than it helped. How did the Depression affect the regular lives of Americans? As we gauge this impact, we know that there was widespread unemployment. As many as 1 in 5, maybe even 1 in 4 American workers were out of work. There was a great deal of homelessness, a collapse of the banking system. Bank closings, of course, caused investors to lose all the money that they had deposited. There were no protections if you put money in a bank. The demand for goods went way down, and therefore people were left without jobs. People went hungry and were forced to stand in long bread lines. There was a growth in political unrest. Militancy or disgust and more of a violent attitude seemed to sweep across labor unions. There were farm foreclosures across the Midwest and the West. Migration occurred as people left their homes in search of jobs someplace else. And of course, farmers' problems were compounded by one of the worst natural disasters in America up to that time. The farmers of the Great Plains suffered from a devastating drought that was called the Dust Bowl.